Metal Man should be banned from any future Mega Man games because his saw is way too overpowered. I'm not kidding. This is the second game I've played with his metal saw, and it's the second time I've coasted through a game because of how it operates. You'd think they'd have nerfed it a bit after how it played in the NES game, but I swear it's identical. It's just as powerful, the reach is just as good, and the rate at which the ammo goes down as you spam it makes it feel like it's a never-ending weapon. On Mega Man II on the NES, the difficult setting you wouldn't get many ammo drops, so you wouldn't necessarily get to feel how big of an advantage the saw gives you until you play the NES game on regular normal mode. But in this game, Mega Man II for the Game Boy, by the way, I should have started off with that. Anyway, in this game, the ammo drops are plentiful, so you could get away with using the saw pretty much through the entire game, just like on normal mode on the NES. Come to think of it, all of the weapons operate pretty much identically to their NES counterparts. Well, at least they did in the first and second Game Boy games. That's probably for the best. If you want people to feel like they're getting the experience on the go, the best thing you can do is make it feel and play as similar to the NES versions as possible. In many ways, these first two Game Boy titles have felt like DLC for the NES versions, and I think that's a testament to their strengths. Many of the set pieces in Mega Man II on the Game Boy have felt ripped straight out of the NES version. The opening areas in Airman stage and Leafman stage give me a strange sense of deja vu because of the enemy placement and the platforming in those stages. It's strange though, because I've heard many people complain about this game in particular from the Game Boy lineup, and I just kind of don't understand why. Like, okay, I can kind of understand the complaints when it comes to the music. It feels inferior, like they didn't know how to work around the Game Boy sound chip, but it doesn't sound so terrible that it affects your actual gameplay. From my understanding, this game is the only one in the Game Boy lineup that isn't made by the same developer, so that might have something to do with it. I guess I might figure it out a bit more when I get to the next three Game Boy titles, but as far as I'm concerned, in the same vein that I didn't find Mega Man 1, or rather Dr. Wily's Revenge on the Game Boy to be considered the super difficult, unplayable game that many people claimed, I also don't find Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy to be the super different and inconsistent experience that doesn't feel like it's in line with the rest of the series. Both of these Game Boy games so far feel in line with what I expect from Mega Man on the Game Boy after having played the first three NES games. I have a hypothesis that these first few Game Boy games have retractors because people play them and subconsciously compare them to the later NES titles, 4 through 6 specifically. I wonder how many people actually jumped straight from the first three games to the Game Boy titles in the way that I have, because I don't know how good you guys think Mega Man 1 through 3 feel on the NES, but as far as I'm concerned, they feel the exact same way as the titles that I'm playing on the Game Boy. And I'm not saying that to downplay the NES games. I'm saying that because the first two Game Boy titles are that good. There was an issue with Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy being a bit too easy though. I hardly died and I had a ton of lives going into the final fight. Also, since I knew the weakness order, it was very easy for me to determine my order. I knew I wanted Metal Man's weapon quick, so I went to grab the Crash Bomb as quickly as possible to make sure I can defeat Metal Man. After that, almost all the boss fights until the end of the game became a typical joke. But again, that's in line with the early NES titles when you know the weakness chain. The other thing is, this game introduces the E-Tanks, which you barely need. I had 4 going into the final boss, so I used them generously and defeated the final boss without breaking a sweat. My point is that the only complaint I can really have about Mega Man 2 is that it's extremely easy since I knew the weakness order, and when I played the first 2 games on the NES, it felt the exact same way when I did my second playthroughs and knew the weakness chain. I kinda like how in the first Game Boy game you start off against 4 stages and Robot Masters ripped straight from the NES titles, followed by a boss rush against 4 from the second game. While in Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy, you start off against the other 4 remaining bosses from the second game as your opening 4 stages, followed by 4 bosses from the third NES game. This makes these Game Boy titles a bit unique since they're kind of like a marriage or a midpoint between the two titles. Which is pretty cool because you get things like Rush Marine and Mega Man Slide Attack and various weapons that would only be available in one game, but you get to apply it to the assets from the other game as well. This game does expand on the formula a bit. Rather than the second half of the game just being a boss rush, you're now given 4 stages to play through in addition to the boss fights. I think this is much better. The boss rushes, while fun to flex, often feel like a quick waste of time. Especially when you consider that when you do a boss rush, you usually do it when you first find out the weakness order. But since you're playing these Game Boy games, and it's the same bosses, you already know the weakness order, and you've already done a boss rush, so it feels redundant. Similar to the previous title, after you get through the 4 additional boss stages, you once again face off against a unique enemy, before taking on Dr. Wily. Speaking of that unique enemy, the story in this game is the same as every game prior to this, but this time there's some kind of time travel theme. In the later stages, you have these clocks in the background too, which is a neat touch. Apparently, the unique boss you faced off against was a version of Mega Man from the future that Dr. Wily traveled to and captured and altered to make him evil. It's a cool premise, but it is a Game Boy game, so you don't really feel the impact of the story. Also, it's a laughably easy boss fight, which is consistent with the entire game. Anyway, let's run through the stages and discuss some more intricate details of this game. I just realized while pulling up my gameplay footage that this game took me all of like 40 minutes to get through, so this should be a fairly simple run through. Like I mentioned before, I wanted the Metal Saw, so I went after Crashman, who in this game is called Clashman, because I knew that's what I needed to beat Metal Man. If I knew how easy this game was, I probably would have just gone straight to Metal Man, because I'm sure I could have probably beaten him without a sweat. Crashman's stage sees you traverse upwards up some ladders while avoiding some of those soda can with eyeball looking bosses we saw in the NES titles. When you make it to the top, you get treated to another familiar enemy, the stack of 4 soda cans, that take 2 hits to defeat. Not 1, which I like, because that means it's consistent with the difficult mode in Mega Man 2, which is what was intended. Next, you have to continue to traverse upwards on the platform on the designated paths, while dodging more soda cans. I'm sure if I did the stage later, I'd have been able to use Rush Jet to cheese through most of it. The next big challenge is dropping down through the stage while avoiding spikes and battle an enemy. But if you're up to the challenge, you'll be given a chance to refill ammo and health. When you make it to the bottom, you get swarmed with more soda cans and have to jump through some narrow paths before working your way back up again, and dodging some of those egg-dropping birds. Being able to collect regenerators and E-tanks before making it to Crashman and beating him with a pea shooter, albeit while putting in a good effort to dodge his predictable pattern. Let's go get that Metal Saw. Oh, what the heck, that's annoying. These trust fall drops get on my nerve, but thankfully they're not super terrible in this game. Most of the start of this stage involves going through conveyor belts while avoiding obstacles and enemies. You'll eventually make it to some narrow areas that you can slide under. That's actually when I realized this slide was available in this game. And the third area just sort of combines the same enemies. The same conveyor belts and the same narrow slide areas until you make it to Metal Man. Hit him with a few crash bombs and make light work of him pretty easily. Now that we have the Metal Saw, we can head straight to Woodman stage to chop him down. The start of this stage is so similar to the start of the NES one, down to the placement of the bats and rabbits attacking you. And when you make it down, you get to the fire-breathing tigers too. While the Metal Saw should help you take care of and get through pretty quickly, since none of them are awkwardly placed in a cramped area like they were on the NES version. Eventually you get to the lower area, which takes place over water, and you have to time your slides below some protruding obstacles. I like this because those are assets taken from the third NES game placed in a stage with the second NES game. But anyway, you work your way up, saw down some ostriches, and make it to Woodman. Spam your saw attack when his defenses are down, and he should be defeated in no time. And finally, we have Airman stage, which for me feels like the easiest stage in the game. Most of it just involves jumping on these head platforms with the horn. This is much more bearable in this game because the knockback when a screw horn touches you isn't nearly as annoying as the NES version. Also, it's a bit weird because you have to get pretty close to the end of the platform for the next one to show up. After a few sections with those weird heads, you face off against a Zeus enemy and commandeer his clouds to platform across the map. Shortly after that, you can make it to Airman and use your leaf attack to kill him in a split second. Air shooter received, all 3 rush weapons on hand, time to go to the endgame. We get a rare cutscene, and then are dropped into a room that's meant to make you think that you're in a boss rush. I went into the first room and it ended up being Needleman's. I hated these porcupines on Mega Man 3 on the NES, but in that game, I didn't have the Metal Saw, so I don't mind them here. This stage is pretty straightforward. Knock out some anti-air turrets, use Rush a bit to advance, use the Metal Saw to easily push forward. Of course, you're also given chances to pick up E-tanks and the like as you advance. The next challenge involves sliding under needles before beating a jumping enemy and getting to Needleman. I experimented a bit and figured out that the air attack beats him pretty easily, so I'm glad that was all taken care of. Next, I entered Magnet Man stage. Once again, the Metal Saw makes a lot of the enemies and challenges in the stage a joke. There's nothing really of note, more returning enemies, some moments with magnets that try to throw you off balance, simple disappearing block challenges that you can skip with Rush Jet if you really wanted to, opportunities to collect E-tanks and regenerators. You make it to Magnet Man pretty quickly, the needle attack takes care of him pretty quickly too. Next, I went to Hard Man. This stage involves a lot of sliding around to dodge different enemies and advance. You're often rewarded with pickups if you take on a bad guy or put some extra effort in areas with split paths. There are a lot of enemies in this stage that are up and to the right of you for your location. The Magnet Gun works perfectly for them, just like how it did on the NES version. But over here, you can still use the Metal Saw, so there's no need for that child play. You also have to beat some of the Metal Construction Soldiers and then make your way to Hard Man. Equip the Magnet. Then when I ran out of Magnet ammo, I switched to the Rush Coil by accident, but Rush Coil gives you a pea shooter, so I used that to finish him off regardless. Finally, you take the Hard Knuckle and you enter the final stage. You can either jump through disappearing blocks or use Rush Marine. Beat up some Metals, skin a cat, pick up the regenerators, slide a bunch, defeat construction workers, and use the metal saw to make light work of every spinning enemy you encounter. You'll encounter quite a few, and you'll be able to beat them pretty quickly. The final area is a platforming challenge that Rush Jet can just fly right through. Finally, you make it to Top Man, and using the hard knuckle you get rid of him very quickly. Next, you fight Mega Man from the future on a pogo stick. He's very easy to dodge and shoot in the head, and it's a nothing fight. After you take care of him, you go to a Wily stage that's supposedly the final challenge. It throws everything at you that you've already experienced. A lot of climbing ladders, and ample opportunities to restock whatever you need. And of course, ample chances to use the metal saw to make light work of everything around you, including a Rush Marine area that by this point I didn't even feel was worth stopping at to grab a collectible because I had 8 lives and 4 E-Tanks, and this was also just so easy. I used 1 E-Tank near the end of the stage since I had plenty. You have to climb upwards against a bunch of Zeus robots and use their clouds while avoiding birds. Then you make it to Wily. You basically can either use the pogo stick or the pea shooter to damage him. He has 3 phases. It's all the same type of challenge. You need to carefully headshot him in all the phases to defeat him. The end of the game is about as easy as the journey throughout. It's a fun and short experience, albeit too easy of an experience, but fun nonetheless. I actually associate this whole experience with the NES Mega Man 2 during my second playthrough, where I knew the boss chain and I knew to grab the metal saw and I was playing on normal mode. I flew through that game on the second attempt, and in the case of this game I was able to do it on my first attempt because of the knowledge I had gained from playing that game first. Regardless, this is a short journey. Similar to the first Game Boy title, I recommend it to anyone that already has NSO to give it a shot. Even if you've never played a Mega Man game before, this is yet another game I'd recommend as a good starting point in the series. I'll be honest, of the games I've played so far, the only NES game I recommend as a first game for newcomers is Mega Man 3, but I recommend both Game Boy games. I think they're much better options to start the series with because they're much more forgiving and much easier than the NES counterparts, especially if you don't know the required boss order. And if you're not going to look up the boss order, then definitely start with Mega Man 2 on the Game Boy prior to Dr. Wily's Revenge, because Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy is a much more forgiving title, and it should be easily beatable for even the newest fan of the franchise. But man, I've actually enjoyed this Game Boy sidestep. I am ready to go back to the NES titles though. I'll be running through Mega Man 4 next, and I've heard in some circles that it's actually the first complete title on the NES, which should be exciting because I thought Mega Man 3 was pretty complete. Keep an eye out for my regularly scheduled drops. As always, thanks for watching. Dean, out.